Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Unconventional Entrepreneurship. I'm Jörg Zucki, and I have the pleasure to be joined by the esteemed Professor Andre Thomashausen, somebody whose views and perspectives I have admired for the longest of time. And I think in these chaotic times, it is truly even more crucial to get some perspective of what is going on. Professor, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Is the world about to end?
Thank you, Jörg, and good morning to everyone. Look, I definitely don't think so. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here relaxedly. I would maybe be praying somewhere. Humanity has had enormous challenges at least over the recorded part of our history. We've had the plague in Europe that destroyed more than half the European population. The then Pope only survived because he took rescue in the city of Avignon and put a wall of fire around the city and caused people to keep that fire going for 2 years. We've had the Spanish flu just before World War I, which decimated, again, about half the population of Europe. We've had HIV/AIDS that has, especially in Africa, taken a terrible toll. So this is not the first time that humanity is challenged, but there are very serious and great thinkers that will actually characterize this as the Third World War. It is hitting our generation like World War II hit the generation of our parents. We are faced with a massive destruction of capital. The savings of people are melting away. We are faced with shortages, with supply shortages, because the supply chains are breaking down. More transport, air and sea is basically halted in the world. The world is basically put into a freeze, into an economic freeze. It's very difficult to calculate the mid and long-term impact of that. But like the other huge calamities, I think that humanity will obviously come out of this. And in the process of coming out of it, a lot of innovation, a lot of original defenses will come up. A tiny example that I learned yesterday, that Polish housewives have suddenly got together first in Warsaw and then in other cities, and they're sewing masks, and they identified and obtained materials that are colorful. So you can actually order your mask. You can have a mask with little hearts on, or you can have a mask with little Donald Ducks jumping on it. And they started a business that has virtually exploded. So yes, they also have a government that is very rational. The government has suspended the imposition of VAT tax, so that small initiatives like this can start up easily and can succeed. And of course, it gives hope to people, because if you do something and you generate something and you have success, well, that's the best antidote to depression. So I'm not a doomsday sayer. I'm not saying South Africa will have 1.8 million corpses, 1.8 million dead people in the next 2 weeks. There are statisticians that are saying this. I think these linear projections, they ignore the ability of humans to adjust and to react very quickly.
And I wanted to ask in that respect, I am perennially glass half full kind of person. And whenever a major shock hits the system, incredible innovation amongst the lines of what you mentioned, the belief in humanity to learn, to adapt, to grow. Could this be, with all the pain that comes with it, and I'm not making light of the 50,000 people who died and the many more who will suffer, but could this be the shock to the system we as humans needed to just slow a little bit down, to take the environment more seriously, to stop this ever-growing consumerism and consumption and non-stop growth targets?
Sure. The world had become very frantic. I remember the ridiculous story about a year back of a stockbroker in New York who who actually ended up with an incurable physical condition because he was so tense and so focused and so in a chase mode that for 8 days he didn't go to the toilet. So this is the extreme example how this chase mode, the racing mode, can destroy us. And as we both know, and many of our listeners will know, until a few weeks ago, a lot of people were never switching off their social networks and their phones. We're working 18 hours a day. We're waking up every hour at night to answer things because they had colleagues or bosses in different time zones, and everything was being done in a chase. There was no more long-term vision, no more long-term strategy in big corporates or governments. Big corporates were driven by their 3 monthly results, and nothing else mattered. People's careers depended on that. And governments were driven by their 4-year election cycle, which means that latest in year 3, they have to start campaigning to be re-elected. So we've also had, I believe, terrible impacts on the environment because of this mode, because of this race and chase mode. Now that has come to a standstill. Suddenly we're discovering very interesting things, that we can run a classroom, a normal school classroom, perfectly through this media, through video conferencing, that we can even have a G20 meeting with video conferencing, and the G20 meeting is as meaningful and successful as if people had spent millions flying in executive jets all around the world, polluting the stratosphere. We seem to be surviving without millions of flights in every week. So yes, I think there will be a reflection. More lightly, I believe that for quite some time people will no longer shake hands. Our social conduct will change a little bit. So we will also get used to living in complete silence. At the moment, in the lockdown areas, there's complete silence. There are no aeroplanes above us and there are no cars on the road. So it will disturb us when everything suddenly switches back on and there's a lot of noise around us. There are quite a number of changes that this will bring about. And yes, the world is shocked that this jumping of a virus from the animal kingdom to our human realm is maybe the result of our ruthless incursion into nature. We do not respect nature. We destroy forests the size of continents, and then we're surprised that our CO2 levels rise, and we want to then clean up our exhaust pipes instead of replanting the forests. We start eating things that weren't meant to be eaten, and then the shock hits us that nature actually fights back. And I was disturbed by a Twitter posting of our just departed Chinese ambassador to South Africa, Song Qiang, where he proclaimed on Twitter very proudly a few days ago, actually, China has won the war against nature. And he meant there are no more new infections in China. Well, that is absurd. Anybody who has any understanding of the force of nature and of how little we understand about it knows that number one, we cannot win a war against nature. And number two, we should never engage in a war of nature. We should live in harmony with nature. That will be probably the positive outcome of this virus crisis.
We saw a trend until recently of a movement towards decentralization and an emergence of tools like blockchain, like co-working spaces, like remote connecting. A lot more is coming where we don't need, whether in physical form or in intellectual form, to be clustered together around an office block or around a table, as the examples that you mentioned. Could this be the shock to the system, be that which allows us or incentivizes us to move away from clustering to cities, to move and embrace much more technology that allows Andre to trust York or to trust Pilo. Is this the kind of movement which you think can actually be truly beneficial to bring back the quality of life to humans, and let's call it the embracement of a more natural existence with environment?
Well, let us hope so. Let us hope so that we will become, that we will emerge from this crisis sometime in July or August, much more sobered up, literally, because the consumption of alcohol has become more difficult. But there is, of course, also a risk that the grave danger to all nations will result in more repressive forms of administration and government, and further curtailment of freedom. And again, the more pessimistic of us, they fear that China could impose its governance model, a pyramid authority structure on the whole world as a better solution to regulate and control the movement of people, regulate and control the spreading of diseases, and actually restart the economy by means of command economy, by means of planification, and not necessarily by market forces. That is a grave danger for which humanity will pay dearly if it happens, because no human plan, no human regulation can be wiser than the forces of nature, than the balance that we have in all things on this planet, including our economic activities. You cannot plan by command the successful activities of the ladies in Poland that are sewing together masks. So, but yes, there is a danger that for quite some while we will not be able to travel freely as we used to. But before you may be allowed to travel, we may have to undergo very extensive health examinations and blood tests, or that there may be mandatory quarantines on arrival. All these things are unfortunately possible. It's speculative because nobody knows whether this progression will be as severe as many virologists predict, exponential. If we have 1.8 million dead in South Africa and 80 million dead in Africa, and maybe 30 to 40 million dead in America, then of course there will be severe reactions. Governments will try to impose extreme regulation, and societies will revolt and rebel against this. We may end up having a new type of a French Revolution going around the world, where people just refuse to become robots that have to function according to a very strict regiment and plan. But it's unpredictable. We don't know whether this virus will be as devastating or whether the preventative measures that we've adopted, the distancing and also the isolation, whether they will not keep the effect of the virus, at least the effect on human life, fairly manageable, fairly low. Then we have to deal with the economic consequences. But there, I think, once the lid is lifted, economies and new forms of being productive, they will just mushroom, they will explode. And part of that will be better use of the virtual space, on the technologies. People will very quickly understand that you don't need a classroom to learn equations. You don't need a classroom to learn vocabulary. On the contrary, the computer will teach you a better pronunciation than any teacher could. Mm-hmm. So many things will be able to happen in the virtual space that will save us time. Instead of spending 3 or 4 hours in traffic every day, we'll be able to get on with the things we want to do, and we will have more time for our leisure, for developing our arts and our talents, and our relationships. Modern families have very poor relationships because people people actually spend 14 to 16 hours away from each other because they lose up to 4 hours in traffic. Then they are in an office for 8 hours. And when they come home, they have to cook, they have to wash their clothes, they have to fill in their tax forms, they have to do all sorts of administrative things. So time for togetherness with your family and your friends, ridiculously curtailed.
On this notion, you know, you mentioned governments coercing, putting more stricter measures, and it might be a temporary thing. Nation states per se are a relatively recent phenomenon in the last 150 years. The idea of, you know, having boundaries, having a population from which you can get taxes to pay for armies, control, etc. And yet the world is moving away from that. Freedom of goods, we're seeing global supply chains, people traveling more, still within the boundaries of existing restriction, passport, visas, and all that. But is this a case of governments desperately trying to hold on to the old, let's call it, business model? Is it possible that maybe people's freedom will actually tilt the needle towards a less interfering government?
Definitely, let's hope so. Big government will become weaker after this crisis because big government will have run out of money. So they will not have the funds or the credit to pay a lot of people to do what they want them to do. People will be more dependent on their own initiative. Farmers will come out strongly out of this because they don't need a government to produce. But they need customs, they need transport, they need to get their things to their markets. The South African wine industry may perish in these weeks because some stupid bureaucrat in an overzealous mindset determined that no wine may be exported from South Africa to the markets where it normally is supplied. So there are about 2,000 containers of South African wine that cannot leave Cape Town Harbor. And once you lose your presence in a market, it will take you a long time to regain it. So that's my worry about over-regulation, that all sorts of regulations are put in place for completely selfish reasons because some government department wants to be important and not driven by logic.
Yeah.
I'm a believer in the four fundamental freedoms: the freedom of movement of persons, of capital, of services, and of know-how. So if we tamper with these freedoms, then the world economy will be a different one. At the moment, South Africa is still benefiting from these freedoms. 2 days ago, a South African bond issue was very successful. It was fully taken up within a few hours, meaning the world money, the world markets still have confidence in South Africa. They're buying South African bonds, even in the middle of this crisis, even 2 days after the downgrade. So, but that assumes a freedom of movement of capital. It assumes a free market. It assumes a free capital market, and I hope that that big governments, especially the United States and the European governments and the European Union, will resist the temptation of starting to increasingly regulate any capital flows and currency movements out of fear that there might be unforeseen consequences if you allow that freedom. For our recovery, we will need more economic freedom and not less.
I wanted to ask you, you were for, I think, some 34 years with one of the world's largest distance learning institutions in the Unisa. On a very practical level, Unisa, in a way, was almost the forefront of the world that we're entering, notwithstanding certain departments, certain divisions. What kind of advice would you give to businesses around the world who are entering now an era of democratization, of remote working, of distance, where measurement of one's performance isn't based on how many hours somebody came to the office and sat in a chair. What are your experiences from your Unisa days?
Well, Unisa, that's actually why I came to South Africa. I was 32 years old then, because I got so fascinated by that model that you can, with a minimal number of teachers, at the time about 1,000 university lecturers, you can give a good service to, at that time in '82, to 100,000 students, which in a residential setup would have been completely impossible. So it was really an enormous shift in efficiency and productivity. The Unisa model got into trouble because the Unisa model was based on the assumption of a fully functioning postal service everywhere in the world, quick and cheap, and that was true in the '80s. And then nowadays, that's not true any longer. The South African postal service is basically dysfunctional. You can wait up to 6 months for a letter to be delivered, if at all it gets delivered. And the postal services in many other countries are broken down, or they're available only at a very, very high cost through private courier companies. So the transition would have had to be from printed media distributed by mail to electronic, to digital media distributed by internet. And unfortunately, Unisa missed that train a little bit, and it's trying to catch up now, but we're late. All major best universities in the world are running digital courses. Harvard, Yale, all the best universities, and they have enrollments of 200, 300, 350,000 students in a marketing course, for instance. So the cost of that course can come down, can become insignificant. And the quality of the course, of course, is very good, because that's what these universities produce. And it's truly democratic. Everybody has access to it, affordable access. So the downside is a bit that you will have to look for your human interaction elsewhere, not in your learning space and not in your working space, but in your private space, in your friend space. But I think humanity can very, very well do that and cope with that, because your human interaction with the people that you actually like is of a much higher quality than the human interaction with your work colleagues that you may or may not like. Yeah. So I think that is definitely a thing coming. I've been lucky in the last 3 years to be able to serve as a subject matter expert in the Emirates to do quality assessments, quality control. And I have seen how the Emirates have embraced the enormous opportunity of the digital world. In the Emirates, it takes you never more than about 15 minutes to get your driver's license renewed. Things are digitally so well organized and prepared that also the working environment for people has become so much nicer and so much less stressful, because the machines do all the repetitive tasks, and you don't have to yourself fiddle with a printer to see if the stupid driver license plastic fits in there or not. All these things are automated, and you have optimal quality control, because things get numerically measured. So you see the output, you see who is slacking, who takes a lot longer than the other work colleagues in performing a task. You can also monitor, and they do, in any public attendance situation, how long it takes for somebody to be attended to, because you register when you enter the administrative space with your fingerprint, and then the system knows Mr. XYZ has entered, and then the system after 15 minutes can query, why is this person not progressed? Why is this person still sitting in a waiting room? These things I think we will embrace. We can embrace them politically. We can, there's a fantastic Austrian-French software company. You can give their URL later if people are interested, that are organizing fully digital electronic elections in over 40 countries now. There's no more wasting of ballot papers. There's no more arguing about the result. The result is determined with a 100% accuracy by a machine. It has taken on fascinating forms in Estonia, for instance, where you actually vote for a whole month on your app, on your cell phone. You can vote as many times in a day as you like, and you can change your vote all the time. And the candidates, they see the graph of the votes that have so far been given to them, and they really sweat. They really suffer in that month because they see the impact immediately of what they're saying. And at the final moment, when the election time closes, 0 hours, the last count is the election result. But it teaches politicians an enormous degree of humility, because for a month, they become aware of what people want and what people think. So these are the digital world can offer fantastic new dimensions. But yes, we have to readjust. We will increasingly not do our shopping in a big, crowded, and possibly infectious warehouse style store, but we'll do it online through Amazon. In America already, most shopping happens through Amazon.
I want to finish our interview with the quote by Thomas Friedman, where he said, talking about the future of work, and it fits beautifully into what you say. If you're self-motivated, this world is tailored for you. The boundaries are all gone. But if you are not self-motivated, this world will be a challenge, because the walls, ceilings, and floors that protected people are also disappearing. There'll be fewer limits, but also fewer guarantees. Your specific contribution will define your benefits much more. Just showing up will not cut it. And I love what you said about Estonia. I love what you say about the Emirates, that the tools, the technology, the know-how does exist to make this world much more frictionless, if you'd like. Maybe a lot of us are just scared that our skills, that our ability to add value and to earn a living might just be eroded if we embrace this new exciting world too openly.
Yes, there's a big debate everywhere, also with the so-called Industry 4, where the machines will take away our jobs. But it is true that a sophisticated economy will need less human input. There's some statistic out there that in Germany, of the working population, in the average, they only actually work 2.5 hours per day. The rest of the time is traveling to get to work, it's administrative tasks, and it's holidays and it's leave and whatever. And that is possible because those 2.5 hours are so much more productive. And I think Germany shows that people can adjust very easily. They have an increased amount of spare time, and they use that spare time. They use it for their happiness. And the American Constitution at the outset proclaimed that everyone has the right to the pursuit of happiness. And that is really, there's nothing wrong with that. Why should people be stressed and actually live like slaves in ancient Egypt? Why must people be forced to be away from a relaxed state for 14 or 16 hours a day? It's bad for your health. It's bad for our family health, and it's probably bad for our civilization, because it kills originality, it kills ideas, it kills productivity. So yes, this is a wake-up call, this terrible virus crisis. It causes people, it also gives people time to reflect on how we're living and how have we organized our lives, and can't we do it in a more humane way and also in a safer way. Why do people, I mean, when we step into a underground train in New York or in Paris or in Tokyo, why do people have to travel to their work like sardines in a tin, which is per se very unhealthy and very uncomfortable and very stressful? These things have to change. Maybe all these new ideas will find new markets when the economies restart. Let us hope that we can somehow overcome the need for enormous amounts of capital. Once this is over, the resources of government will be depleted, and the ability of markets to make available loan capital will also be at their, will have exceeded their limits. Europe is thinking of a Corona bond to try and raise the billions that will be needed to restart companies. Many companies, I mean, the choice for companies is either to carry on paying salaries and go bankrupt, close, and then maybe not be able to restart, or dismiss people and make their livelihood, make their income the problem of the unemployment funds. America is going that latter way. Most people are being unemployed, and the state will struggle to find the money to pay the unemployment benefits. We here in South Africa and in most parts of Europe, we are trying to force companies to carry the burden, but they will not be able to do that for much more than 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And then those companies will just fold. And this will then become an enormous challenge to the macroeconomics and to the finance specialists. Unfortunately, the way the world has responded to these situations in the past after the Great Wars is by depreciating currencies and essentially expropriating all those who have savings. And that would be quite terrible, because that again would deplete the countries of capital. Because if you take the savings capital away and consume it, then there's none to start circulating again. So there will be, we'll need politicians to be able to listen to original economists, to economists that have good ideas, not just traditional stereotypes. South Africa will definitely in 2 or 3 weeks reach the limits of what the finance department and the Reserve Bank can supply and can do. And then probably the choice will be to accept that the virus may have to run its course, or to risk famine, to risk massive civil unrest also. I hope we don't go that route. Sometimes one has to also be humble and know that we are not in control of our destiny. We cannot win the war against nature. We can only try and survive it.
Beautiful. Professor, thank you so much for your time, for your perspective. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jörg. Thank you all. Been a pleasure.